Hello and welcome to the Shepheard-Walwyn podcast series. My name is Jonathan Brown. Shepheard-Walwyn is a campaigning book publisher based in London, England. Our purpose is to uncover and promote new ideas to society's oldest problems. And whilst our specialty is ethical economics, something Anthony Werner, our driving force for over 40 years, has pioneered, we have branched out over the years to other related areas such as the environment and the lives and works of society's change agents. These podcasts promote ideas we're convinced can actually help us build a better society for all of us. So have a listen and be sure to share with your friends if you like them, but also tell us what you think. These are debates we all need to be part of. So without further ado, let's get into the interview.
My guest today is Kris, contributor to some of Shepheard-Walwyn's most important works, including The Corruption of Economics, A Philosophy for a Fair Society, and the recently re-released Rent Unmasked. After obtaining a degree in philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania, Kris stumbled upon the writings of Henry George, which stimulated a career both as a student and then as a teacher of economics. And after teaching at a number of places, Kris found her workplace home at Bard College, where she taught economics and environmental studies from 1991 until her recent retirement in 2023. Kris has also served on the boards of Robert Schalkenbach Foundation, the Henry George School, and also the American Journal of Economics and Sociology.
Kris, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Jonathan. Great to finally meet you.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure because you've done a cameo in some of my favourite works from Shepheard-Walwyn, whether that's Philosophy for a Fair Society and The Corruption of Economics. I know we're officially here to talk about Rent Unmasked, but I'd love to get into the wider body of your work, Kris, which is really very deep. You've been working with Fred and Mason and Michael Hudson for such a long time. It's lovely to finally get to speak with you.
I study at their knees and try to reproduce as best I can their profound thoughts. To give you a little background, I started out as a philosophy major, moved in after my second year to Philadelphia, and a few years after my move, I guess I must have moved in 72, so it was the late 70s, there was the oil crisis, inflation, stagflation. It didn't really affect me. I was too poor to have a car or own a home, but I was very curious and I recalled having taken an economics elective in high school and something about Adam Smith. A friend mentioned there was a place 2 blocks from my apartment called the Henry George School of Economics and Social Science, and a plaque outside mentioning it was the birthplace of the great Henry George. I stopped in. It turned out they were offering a 10-week course in fundamentals of economics for $10. And I ended up taking all of their 3 classes and eventually teaching one of them. That's where I met George Collins, the director, and Ed Dodson, who is still active. He's very much of a journalist and thinker, as well as collector of all things relevant on his website. That's how I got interested in Henry George. After going through those courses, I concluded that I must be too stupid to figure out what's wrong with it, because obviously all the real economists had long since rejected Henry George. He must be wrong, and it was important to me to find out why and where he was wrong. That's why I ended up going to graduate school for economics, and I wound up finally graduating in 1992, by which time I had already landed in upstate New York at Bard College, where I only recently retired.
Wow. How did you meet Mason Gaffney?
I met him at a conference in the very early 80s. It was through my connections at the Henry George School. He was a speaker, and it was somewhere near upstate New York. I managed to get myself there, and that's where I met him. I became an aficionado. I tried to read all his works, but he writes faster than I can read. I'm still catching up, but yeah, that's when I became a reader and a student of Mason Gaffney.
And what would you say was the impact that he had on economics and on your ideas as well?
I can't really say how much impact he's had on economics in general, but what he certainly did do was he brought the basic principles and instincts of Henry George and others, such as early Austrian economists, together using the language and modeling of mainstream economics. If you were one of the tens of millions of Americans who had taken Econ 101, and even if you hadn't, but you were functionally literate, you would be able to understand that in language that is much more familiar and comfortable to Americans. He published in 1879. And was hugely active politically in New York City during years of working class revolts, riots, unionization, street protests and strikes. It was a very contentious time during the industrialization of America, and especially in New York City. Mason Gaffney explained neoclassical economics from a perspective that is missing in the textbooks of, by, and for neoclassical economics.
So what are some of Mason's insights that people would benefit from understanding today, especially in the context of new governments? We've got a new government in the UK, and you're about to have one, given the recent election of Donald Trump.
Yep.
What were some of the insights from Mason that would benefit from getting today?
Starting at the most basic point, we today, and for a long time, since even long before the Cold War, tend to think in terms of the duality of capitalism versus socialism, communism, and of labor versus capital. We think of labor and capital as the two competing coalitions, each scrambling to get a larger share of the economic pie. What George taught, and as Gaffney followed up on, that there are three distinct factors of production: labor, land, and capital. Land is the standard classical term, not just for farmland, but for everything under the sun and the sunlight too, what nature provides us. But we did not produce and could not produce if we wanted to. That's quite different from capital, which in George's taking is just a form of wealth that arises when we apply our human labor to the materials and forces of nature. We call it capital as opposed to a toothbrush if it's going to be used to produce more wealth rather than in direct household consumption. And they then distinguish between the incomes of the three factors, where labor earns wages, which include salaries, land earns rent, and capital earns interest. If there's anything left over from the value of the product as it's sold on the market after the factors are paid, then there's profit, just as easily loss, right? Where the revenues don't quite match up with the costs. That falls on the shoulders of the owner of an enterprise. This is straight out of John Stuart Mill and those before him. Ricardo, Adam Smith. By merging land into capital in our talk, we merge the earnings of capital, which have to do with the cost of time and the time it takes between when you start to build your canoe and when you get to eat the fish you caught from your canoe. The point is that so much of what is included in the earnings of capital today is the unearned rent of land. Just the other day, our Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, was asked about taxes, and he made sure to repeat the standard line about we can't tax the job creators and investors. That was Rush Limbaugh's favorite expression, right? The people who own everything are the job creators, right? Well, that's not really true if we're talking about the owners of capital. True capital, they contribute to production, and so do workers. But if you include land rent, which is so, in many places and times, so much a share of what is called profits, then it's just flat wrong. The rent takers are passive recipients of unearned income. They're not job creators. In fact, as Gaffney often argued, if you were to tax away those unearned incomes, then those wealthy people would need to find a more productive place to invest their money, and would maybe conceivably invest in productive capital that employs labor and produces GDP.
And so your contribution to the Rent Unmasked project, what prompted you to want to get involved in that?
Oh, that's too easy. I'll do anything Fred Harrison asks me to do. It's just that simple. I didn't know what I was getting into, but this is much in honor of Mason Gaffney, who is the dean of Georgia economics. All the more reason I couldn't say no. He shines on all things economic. He contributed to every subfield of economics, from finance to urban to agricultural economics, environmental economics, micro, macro, and so forth. It's certainly not easy to summarize, but even to list his various contributions and the way that they all interconnect. The beauty of his way of thinking is that you can find in every subject that he addresses, you can find how it ties into the big picture.
Yeah. You were part of the team that went to Russia, or the USSR, as it helped the Russians convert their economy to one that would produce fairness and prosperity for everybody. What was your experience of being in Russia with the likes of Mason Gaffney, Michael Hudson, and Fred Harrison?
Well, as I said, I'll do whatever Fred Harrison asked me to do. That one was a big one, but it was a real learning experience. The big day was when we each gave a series of speeches with a translator beside us to the Russian Duma, their giant parliament. They listened politely. Later on, translations in print were made available to them all. I don't know if any action was taken. Certainly, we don't hear anything from the Duma today in the Putin era. But we did have dinner with the chair of the Russian Natural Resources Committee, and he was a giant, burly, boisterous, jovial fellow who tempted the men at the table into a drinking contest with toasts all around. I didn't participate much in that part. The one thing I do remember him explaining to us was that Russia did not have an environmental problem. So while their ideas could provoke some interest, they really weren't all that relevant to the situation in the former USSR.
That's him saying that Russia didn't have an environmental problem was that they clearly did, and there was massive amounts of degradation that had come through that period of communism, right?
Oh yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah.
It led nowhere. The IMF, the powers that be, OECD, of course, I think with sincerity believe that Russia should follow their path toward capitalism. There's that word again.
That's one of the challenges we face, right? Is that a conventionally trained economist can believe sincerely that Georgism doesn't work and there's nothing in it and there's no other way and there's always trade-offs. And the front page of an economics textbook is always economics is a study of scarcity. And I remember reading it in my first economics class. And that's what economics is about. So you're essentially saying that the first page of an economics textbook is wrong and it just goes downhill from there, right?
Mason Gaffney's term for that was futilitarianism. He wrote at length about geofiscalism. Geo, of course, refers not only to Henry George, but to land itself. Geofiscalism versus futilitarianism, which is the broad mainstream of economics today, and as it has been for a long time.
I think that for me is the genius that was explored in the corruption of economics, to take away language and do it so well and such a long time ago that people look at you with this inexplicable look in their eyes when they've got PhDs in economics and they can't.
Well, Jonathan, they have never read Henry George. If they've heard anything about it, it may have been a paragraph in some book somewhere.
Yeah.
Basically, anything they have heard is don't bother.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. In Rent Unmasked, in honor of Mason's work bringing Henry George up to the 20th and 21st century, we've then got a new group of economists such as yourself making it even more relevant to today. So I wonder if we can get into your chapter, Economics from the Ground Up, Public Revenue and the Structure of Production. I just wonder if you can give us an overview, and you mentioned what is geoclassical economics. But first of all, what is your chapter about in the book?
The basic notion, and one that is very much relevant today, is that neither of our major political parties has a correct understanding of how the economy works. Each one, when it is hired into high office, struggles and ultimately fails to fix what at least many Americans feel is deeply wrong. They get voted out. We go to the other party who says they will fix it. We give them a chance. They fail and we go back. Here again, we have the economists in 2024, Janet Yellen, Secretary of the Treasury, saying that America has the greatest economy in the world. We are the envy of the world. Inflation is down and unemployment is down. The perception of that by a third of Americans is altogether missing because in large part of the extraordinary maldistribution of income and wealth. When you average it all together, you get rising GDP. And boy, are the people who own those lands slated for development sitting pretty, right? And every big landowner who gets the implicit subsidies of government provision of infrastructure, the roads, the networks that are needed to function. The message then was the same as now. It's like the blind men and the elephant. Each one feels the trunk, this one the leg, and they can't put it all together. None of them knows what it is. And yet, at a glance, had they seen the big picture, it would have been obvious, right? I think a lot of people who have been steeped in the study of Henry George for a while, like myself, feel like it's obvious. Because everywhere we look, we see the monopoly question. It's not just land, but built on that through corporate power is the huge monopoly problem that's growing. The Biden administration had been bringing serious antitrust suits against social media, Google, and that's all going to go away in a Trump administration. I really don't think Trump is going to do anything that would anger his fellow real estate moguls.
You see Google as a real estate mogul?
In general, the people for whom he promises those taxes, developers in general. Google, infrastructure, land, energy, servers, patents, and other forms of monopoly power. Henry George was not focused exclusively on land, especially after he moved to New York City and got involved in the labor movement and saw what industrialization was doing to the working poor. He especially wanted to tax natural monopolies, the telegraph and the railroads, as opposed to providing taxpayer subsidized infrastructure for the big industrialists. That was his take in the 1880s.
You said it just a minute ago about the monopoly. Is it the monopoly problem? What is that from your perspective?
It's a process that feeds on itself. It has always been with us. It swells and shrinks depending upon external circumstances and the political tides. Once there's a serious class division or inequality of distribution, what happens through the political process, as well as the economic process, is that those who have wealth enough to spare after they have fed and clothed and housed their families have a little something with which to donate to a candidate or lobby their congressman. It's a self-propelling process until you have Donald Trump openly offering to do the bidding of the oil companies so long as they give him $1 billion for his campaign. So you have to cut it off at the root by preventing the accumulation in the first place of unearned incomes. If incomes were truly earned, Henry George argued, there might be somebody who's 10 times as smart and productive as somebody else, but not 300 times, especially somebody who spends most of his day hanging out on his Twitter feed rather than actually working.
Yeah.
Right?
Or even in the spirit of fairness, someone like Nancy Pelosi and her success at stock tips, ensuring that something is fair for someone. On the monopoly side is that someone's able to gain an advantage and then control a resource. You could see Google as a de facto monopoly on search because they're so dominant. I could imagine that Elon Musk is now in the Trump family. It could be that they may do something about Google. It is that whole thing about the fair use of resource, and Trump has said that he wants to get into oil and gas. Drill, baby, drill, I think was his phrase, right?
Right.
And one of the things you talk about in your book and work is how inappropriate tax structures diminish the economy's rent surplus by the sum of tax revenue and excess burden. And you talk about some concepts called ATCOR and EBCOR. I just wonder if you could tell us what they are and why they're important.
ATCOR. Gaffney's shorthand for all taxes come out of rent. Now, way back in 17, David Ricardo, right, who next generation after Adam Smith, showed that a tax on land or the rent of land is paid entirely by the owners of land and cannot be shifted to consumers in higher prices. This is well established in the literature. No economist would say otherwise, right? Labor and capital have some mobility, right? And the point of ATCOR is if a certain taxing jurisdiction defined as an area of land with a geographical boundary, whether it be a city, a state, or a nation. They say, all right, we're going to tax labor with a 20% payroll tax. Well, labor doesn't have to take it. They have to take some of it. But to some extent, workers might decide to move away, go back where grandma lived, retire a little early, take another year of schooling before entering the labor. So you get a little bit less labor, right? Similarly, if you were to tax capital, you get a little bit less capital. Some investments that might have been marginally useful and no longer worthwhile if there is a tax imposed, right? So what happens if, let's say, people move out of town? Take the simple case, payroll tax, or people and businesses move out of town, right? Well, the owners of the land in that town are going to find that the demand for their land has fallen because there aren't so many people that really want to live here. In order to fully rent out their land, landlords have to reduce the asking price. Or if they're the homeowner and want to move out, they have to sell their house for less than they would have gotten otherwise, had that tax not been imposed, chasing lots of other people out and putting a lot of homes on the market to compete with their own. Right? So the idea is that tax on labor pushes down ultimately the rent of land. To the extent that labor is mobile, as the economists say, that is, can escape the tax in one of those ways, they don't see a decline in their wage rate. There may be fewer workers employed here, but their wage may stay the same because any wage below it will send people elsewhere, reducing the supply of workers and bringing the wage back up to equilibrium where supply matches demand. So that's the idea. EBCOR, excess burden comes out of taxation, relates to the fact that when you impose a tax, say, on payroll or one of the other useful, productive things that we do, could be a sales tax and what have you, when you do that, to the extent that people are able to adjust to that new fiscal situation, whether by moving away or investing in something different or somewhere else, or just pocketing their depreciation allowances rather than reinvesting them in the community, whatever they do, assuming the market had allocated those resources efficiently beforehand, these taxes are going to misallocate resources. They're going to cause land, labor, and capital to be combined in ways that make more sense from the point of view of the taxpayer, but not from the point of view of the economy as a whole. That's excess burden. When the value of output that a given set of resources can produce is less than it might otherwise be, just because we have people doing things for which they are not best suited, or land being underutilized, even though much less useful land 20 highway miles down the road is being developed at EBCOR. And the point being that if we were to shift taxes off of payrolls, sales, and incomes, then the value of land would rise not only by the amount of the tax by which payroll is relieved, but by more than that. Those payroll taxes had created that excess burden. And now, as George says, the whole economy is lifted. Gaffney has argued convincingly that the excess burden of taxation is a lot larger than we tend to think.
Yeah. Yeah. Imagine that you get a call from the incoming president of the United States.
It'll be fake news.
What advice would you give to both to President Trump, but also to Prime Minister Keir Starmer on creating a fairer and more prosperous society through the ideas contained in Rent Unmasked?
It's tough at the federal level in the United States. The Constitution would prohibit a national land value tax. Although we tax incomes, there would be challenges in separating different kinds of incomes, especially unrealized capital gains, which are mostly land gains. By the way, those corporations, to the extent that they are owners of land tax gets them too, even without a corporate income tax. And that means the absentee owners who don't live in California, but whose corporate headquarters are there, the foreign investor, they would be contributing to the economy of California through their ownership of corporate shares. Right? So the general idea is you can't do this at a national level, but you can do education at a national level. And I think it's evident now that Americans could use some education. Much can be done at the state and local levels without a constitutional amendment. I don't think it's all that helpful that most of our politicians in Congress and so on are lawyers. They think the way lawyers think. They're not economists. And even worse, they have economists advising them who don't get it, right? As well as the corporate lobbyists and contributors who are trying to write legislation.
So what could we do if federal would require a constitutional amendment? What could we do at state and local levels to apply these ideas that are in the book?
The states have property taxes, which they apply, generally speaking, to real estate, right? Which means land and the building on it. The simplest first step is to stop taxing the building share of a parcel of real estate and tax the land share so much the higher, right? So the average taxpayer would look at their property tax bill, the number might be the same, but what they owe would be divided into two components. The land component has risen and the building component has fallen. Do that a little bit more year by year. And for land where demand is rising, perhaps due to speculation, right? The hope that development will come in our direction, those rents will rise if the assessments keep up. Owners of land that is underdeveloped relative to the value of the land under it will see that their relative tax share rises. They can do something about it by replacing or fixing up their improvements, building something, fixing up the barn, whatever it is. They don't have to pay any property tax when they do that. It adds to their income without adding to their tax. And keeping in mind, the property tax is paid year after year. So if 2% doesn't sound like much, 2 or 3%, but when it's 2 or 3% year after year for the 50 or 80-year life of the building, that adds up. And one thinks about that when planning and financing a project.
Yeah. Brilliant. What would you say would be the most beneficial reason for someone to read Rent Unmasked today?
Oh, it's very accessible and surprisingly relevant today. The fact that it was published a few years ago reflects Mason Gaffney's work over decades. The fact that we can still relate to it right now as problem not yet solved, I think that's a really good reason to pick up that book. There's a new edition of Corruption of Economics. If you're interested in how we got to the language that is confusing on both sides of the Atlantic and the political spectrum, Gaffney's article that on the corruption of economics tells the history of how through the academy and through the landowning powers that be, right, through politics and economics, how we came to the language that has produced the corruption of economics and that prevents students today from even framing the questions that might lead one to think through the issues that George addressed.
Yeah, 100%. I'm more and more convinced that The Corruption of Economics is the most important economics book ever written. Just because of what it is for where we are right now and our problems that we've got and the way in which society is becoming more and more monopolistic and more unfair. It explains so much. And I think Rent Unmasked is that wonderful introduction to Mason's work. I know you also said there's other ways of taking people's, once they've had a look at Rent Unmasked, of taking their reading further for Mason Gaffney. So where can someone do that?
The Robert Schalkenbach Foundation has spent several years working hard to put together a Mason Gaffney digital collection. The only problem I have found is that there is an infinite amount of material, and sorting through it might require a 3-day rainy period rather than an afternoon shower. There's a lot there, but everything is there.
Yeah, well, that's
and Fred Harrison has continued to produce other writings that I think are important.
Yeah, and we continue to promote his work, and we're very excited about the work to come. So, Kris, just in closing, absolutely fabulous to finally get to meet you on Zoom. Thank you very much for your time and contribution.
Well, thank you for making these publications available and for believing them. It's much appreciated.
It's very important work, and you've made a significant contribution to that. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you. It's nice to meet you, and maybe we'll meet again.
Hope so.
All right.
Thank you for listening to the Shepheard-Walwyn podcast. To explore these ideas further, be sure to visit our website, www.shepheard-walwyn.com, and join our mailing list for news and special offers. Check out our authors and buy the books to learn more. And you can also find us on social media. Links are also on the website. And if you like the podcast, please head over to iTunes or Spotify to give us a review. It's surprisingly helpful in getting the ideas out there. So until next time, keep reading